You know, when I heard that the TGC was putting on this conference in November, I was pretty excited, and I did have a chance to reconnect with some friends who have been scattered throughout Ontario and into some other provinces, which is fun. We've been able to link up here today, and I've even had an opportunity to meet some new people. There was a couple of ladies who came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, I saw your picture on the internet. Who are you?" Anyway, and I thought, okay, that's a good way to introduce yourself. So if you would connect with me after, I would love that. I'm here all tomorrow as well. I consider it a really great privilege to be a part of the teaching team here tonight, but I am especially excited to launch into Ruth 3. This is actually a really kind of unique passage because there's so much cultural nuance to it, so much terminology and expressions that are so unique. Sometimes when we read it, it's not as intuitive as some of the other passages. And so I think the best way to approach this tonight is to kind of go through it structure by structure, piece by piece, and kind of bring some clarities to some of those cultural nuances, and then we'll just explode it out at the end for what this actually means to us. Yes? Okay. So a quick story before we launch in. I was talking with my husband earlier this week about a week that we had several years ago now. So I have 3 kids. This would have been when my kids were really little, like infant kind of little. And it was a week where we felt, this probably wasn't the actual case, but we felt like we hadn't slept a minute the entire week. We had babies crying, we had all kinds of stuff going on, and there was a morning on the heels of this, and I was in the kitchen, and my baby was here, and my husband is kind of talking here, and the crying, and I was in such a mental fog of sleep deprivation. I took that pacifier, you know, that soother, and instead of putting it into my baby's mouth, much to the surprise, I put it right into my husband's. And I didn't mean to do that. And it wasn't just me, because later that same day, my husband has this presentation, and he's giving it to, top executives in the company. And so he leaves, and about an hour later, he gives me a call, and he says, "Andrea, I was so tired this morning, I forgot something important for my presentation. And I don't have time to go all the way back home and then come all the way back to the office. I'm going to need you to bring it to me." And I said, "Sure, no problem. What is it that you forgot?" And after a bit of a pregnant pause, he said, "My pants." Is that TMI? That might be TMI. Too late, it's out. Now, I don't know whether any of you have experienced that kind of sleep deprivation that has caused that kind of wardrobe mayhem, but I tell you, my husband and I knew what it was that we needed. We needed rest. But no matter what strategies we put in place, that the doctors told us that we were trying to do, it kept slipping out of our fingers, and we were never able to actually secure it. And I think about our culture today, and I think about how we are in pursuit of a different kind of rest, a deeper kind of soul kind of rest. And if you just Google things like inner peace and happiness and joy, wholeness, satisfaction, this kind of thing, and you see the resources that pop up, if we start to pursue that deeper rest through these kinds of strategies, it's just going to keep evading us, and we'll never be able to secure what it is we're pursuing. And of course, the story of Ruth picks up, especially in chapter 3, this whole concept of rest. We know that Naomi and her husband left God's people to go to someplace else, to seek rest someplace else when the nation was in famine, was in crisis. And a big part of the story of Ruth is Naomi trying to secure that rest that it is that she lost. And so that's where we're going with chapter 3. We're going to journey with our characters as they seek rest, and then they find it, and then we're kind of left hanging at the end of chapter 3 because they're anticipating a deeper, a fuller kind of rest that is to come. Now, are there any people who have just joined us tonight? Okay, you've all been here all day? Okay, oh, one. Okay. Welcome. All right, I was going to do a bit of a recap, but I think that you guys are all on the same page here. So what I'd like you to do now is to open your Bibles to Ruth chapter 3, and we're going to read the text together. And before I do that, one thing that I just want to say is that kind of to set the stage for Ruth chapter 3, it's the time of the barley harvest, which means that the barley crop, it ripens, and then it's harvested, and then it's taken to something called the threshing floor, which is basically just a raised open-air platform where they're going to thresh the grain, so beat it out of its stalks, and then they're going to winnow it. So now they're tossing it up into the air. The wind is blowing away the chaff, and then they're going to stockpile this grain into heaps on the threshing floor. And a landowner like Boaz, he would probably have been sleeping on the threshing floor at night, likely to guard the grain at night from thieves. So with that kind of contextual detail, let's launch into Ruth 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.' And she replied, 'Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today.'" All right, so let's just jump right in. For you note takers among you, this first 5 verses of Ruth could basically be entitled Naomi's Instructions to Ruth. And they were instructions about a strategy. And the strategy was to have Ruth go and propose marriage to Boaz in the middle of the night. And the question here is, well, what's Naomi's end game here? Is she just trying to marry Ruth off, or is there something deeper going on? And we find the answer to that question right out of the gates in verse 1. "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" Which just happens to mirror her prayer to her daughters-in-law back in chapter 1, where she said, "May the Lord grant the daughters-in-law rest in the home of a husband." And she actually circles back to this in verse 18 at the end of the chapter as well. So here's what we know. We know that Naomi is very preoccupied with rest. And rest, of course, is not really something new. It's this resurging theme of promise, because God's people, they're always looking for a land, a place that was secure, that they could identify as God's distinct people, where they could share in God's blessings and have an inheritance in the promised land. And so for Naomi, I think what she was thinking is that, as we'll see, she is concerned with this grander scale of rest, but she's also concerned with Ruth's rest very personally and very individually, that she would have rest secured in the home of a husband, because back then, that was a big deal, right? So the question that kind of spins off that then is, well, why Boaz? Because there was probably a lot of eligible men back then, so why him? And the answer to that question comes in kind of 2 concepts. There's levirate marriage, and then kinsman redeemer. And now this Old Testament law of the levirate. Levirate means brother-in-law. But I think that the principle here, it kind of extends beyond brother-in-law to kind of a close relative in general. And so levirate marriage then is this: when a husband dies and he's had no children, the surviving widow is to marry her brother-in-law, the deceased man's husband. And the idea is, or failing that, a close relative. And then they will have a child, and that child will take on the name of the deceased husband, so that his name is not lost, it's not forgotten in Israel for future generations. Yes? So kinsman redeemer then. Redemption is kind of a funny word. I asked one of my sons the other day, "Do you know what the word redeem means?" And he said, "Mom, I'm growing up in the church. I know what the word redeem means." And I said, "Really? Well, what is that?" And he kind of was totally stumped, deer in the headlights, and he just says, "It means something very, very good." And I think that in Christian circles, words like redemption can be like that. We hear them all the time, and yet when we're pushed to define them, they kind of escape us a little. And now in the next exposition, we're really going to blow this whole redemption concept out a lot. But for our chapter 3 purposes, here's what we need to know. Redemption is deliverance from some kind of evil through the payment of a price. So it's not just freedom, it's freedom at cost. And so there would have been all kinds of redemptive practices back then. But just to give you a kind of idea, a kinsman redeemer might see that a close relative for some destitute situation may have needed to sell himself, say, into slavery. And so maybe because of debt or something like that. And so a redeemer would come along and he would pay the cost associated with preventing the enslavement. And he would do this for other things too, like land. He would pay the cost associated with maintaining the person's property, possessions, and even supporting the next of kin associated with those things. And that really would have been the kind of redemption that Naomi is looking for, this kind of land possession. So Naomi then is thinking, okay, who is a close relative? Who has the resources to do this for us? And who has the character to do this for us? And Boaz fits the bill for all of those things. And before we move on in the text, I just wanted to pause and talk about how bold a strategy I think that this actually is. It's bold because Boaz has no legal obligation to do this. I mean, if he had a legal obligation to do this, Ruth could have just moseyed on up to him in chapter 2 and said, "Hi, I'm Ruth, and I've got a bitter aging mother-in-law saddled to my circumstance permanently, and you are the guy who's going to have to redeem us. Door number 1, door number 2." And he would have had to have said, "All right." But he had no legal obligation. She was going to be asking him here to do this in the spirit of the law, not the letter of it. So it's a bit bold. It's a bit risky. And it was bold because of who she was. We remember what was talked about earlier. She was a Moabite. And you remember who the Moabites were. In Genesis, their origins were of drunken incest. In Numbers, it was the Moabite women who seduced the Israelite men into sexual immorality and idolatry. It was a Moabite king who hired Balaam to curse Israel. I could go on. So the Moabites were not favored. They were not respected people among the Israelite community. And even if you look at the proposal itself, I mean, everything is totally awkward, unfamiliar, backwards. You've got not a proposal in the daytime, you've got it in the nighttime. You've got a Moabite proposing to an Israelite, a woman to a man, younger to older, field worker to a field owner. And what does Naomi say about all of this? All that you say, I will do. And you know, there's even a bit of a lack of clarity to it all too. Because in verse 4, Naomi says to Ruth, "But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And now, I don't want to park here for any length of time, but I think it's worth mentioning because there has been an explosion of commentary about this. Even when you look at the Hebrew original, it's just more ambiguous. Every single word is capable of more than one sense. And so people are saying, wait a second, what is Naomi meaning? Go lie down beside a man who's lying down in the dark secrecy of the night. What is her intent here? But in case you run across this, here's the answer. The text doesn't say. So don't worry about it. Here's what we know. What does the text say? The text says that nothing immoral happens at all on this threshing floor. We know that Naomi and pretty much everybody else knows what? That Boaz is a worthy man and Ruth is a worthy woman. We know that in chapter 2, they put their worthy character on public display for everybody to see. And yet here, in the privacy of chapter 3, they are putting their worthy character on display for one another and God alone. And it's kind of a side principle here, but I think it's a bit of a poke. It's a bit of a challenge to us. Because when we think about the thoughts that we have secretly, when we think about our closest people, our girlfriends, our spouses, whoever they are, is the language and the behavior that we demonstrate, do we capture those moments to be worthy for God? Or is there a great inconsistency between our public selves and our private selves? We got to move on. So Ruth, she complies with Naomi's plan. She makes herself attractive. She goes down to the threshing floor. She uncovers his feet. Maybe this is because the cool air was supposed to wake him up, and that would elicit this conversation. But here in this climactic moment, in the middle of the night, they're now looking at each other, eyeball to eyeball. And Naomi, if you remember, what did she say? Right in this moment, he will tell you what to do. But Ruth kind of breaks the silence and she basically says this, let me clarify. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And you know, there's a lot of different translations that you'll see in your Bibles instead of wings. You'll see spread your skirt or your garment or your covering. And this concept of covering someone over with the corner of one's robe, it symbolizes commitment. But of all those translations, I think the best is wings. And if that's the case, well, where have we heard this word wings before? We heard it back in chapter 2, verse 12, when Boaz prays a blessing on Ruth. He says, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have taken refuge. And where is he getting that word, wings? Well, there's actually a couple of passages that I want to highlight to you tonight. I can't take a deep dive, so write them down and then go look at them later. The first is Exodus 19, verses 4 to 6. And it's a description of God's rescue of Israel from the Egyptians, how he bore them on eagle's wings and brought them to himself. And his intention here is to make a covenant with them, to make them his treasured possession. So it's language that very much operates like a marriage proposal. And what does this marriage proposal between God and Israel, God and his people, actually look like? Well, there is this, albeit kind of a gory but stunning image of this in Ezekiel 16, 6 to 14. And God finds Israel like a newborn baby, and it's still wallowing in its newborn blood. And it's been abandoned like trash, and it's helpless to save itself. And he finds her. He notices her. He covers her with his wing. He washes her. He makes a vow to nurture her to flourishing and advance her to royalty one day. Listen to verse 8. When I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made my vow to you and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord God, and you became mine. So what does all this wing language mean when Ruth is asking Boaz to have her come under his wing? She's asking him to marry her. And it's kind of like she's saying, you know, Boaz, I heard the prayer that you prayed for me back in chapter 2, that I would receive a full reward for coming under the wing of Israel's God. Well, I was kind of thinking about who has the resources to do this for us and the character to do this for us and is a close relative. And well, that's kind of what's happening here. And in 10 and 11, Boaz responds in 2 ways. He says, you have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. So here is what that does not mean. It does not mean that Boaz is saying, Ruth, you're young. You could have had a lot of other young guys, but you have discerned well, and I am indeed Captain America. Actually, where am I? Captain Canada. Sorry, Mary. Apparently, Americans, they marry their cousins. If you don't know what that joke is, please go and talk to Mary after. She'd love to unpack that in depth with you later. The first kindness that he's referring to here is Ruth's first kindness to Naomi, when she abandoned everything, came under Israel's God, and then sacrificed everything to the care of Naomi. That's the first kindness. And this last kindness that he's referring to is her last kindness to Naomi, not to Boaz, that she is willing to marry Boaz, an old guy. Why? So that when they have a child, that child will take on the name of who? Naomi, her mother-in-law, her dead husband's, for their legacy. So this is not only bold and risky and humbling, this is incredibly sacrificial. And his second response is this: yes, I will do for you all that you ask, for all my people know that you are a woman of worth. And the literal translation of this response here is this. Listen carefully. All the gate of my people knows that you are a woman of worth. That turn of phrase, it often gets lost in modern translation, but it reminds us of the Proverbs 31 woman of worth, right? What is she like? She fears the Lord. She's dressed with strength, not idle, full of dignity. Her works bring her praise in the city gate. And I have to say this because this is so cool. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth comes right after the book of Proverbs. So you kind of have this theoretical vision of the woman of worth at the end of Proverbs 31. And then you move into the book of Ruth, seeing a woman of worth set down in difficult circumstances just like you and I. The theoretical becoming, by the power of God, a possible reality. And then we have a bit of a plot twist. You kind of have some tension here at the 11th hour, because there's another dude who is a closer relative who has greater rights to redeem than Boaz. And how that all pans out, I'm going to leave for Mary tomorrow. But for now, here in chapter 3, here's what he says. If this guy doesn't do it, as the Lord lives, I will. And, you know, some of the translations say, if he is not willing, I will. But the language here is so much stronger. It's so much more emphatic, meaning that he is not doing this in the duty of the law because that's what worthy characters do. He is doing this because it is his delight to do this for her. It is his joy to do this for her. And so of all those things we learned this morning from chapter 2, this is kind of an extension of our understanding of Boaz in chapter 3. He continues to be so kind to her. He keeps using this repeated daughter language, this you are in the covenant family, you are in language. He continues to protect her, not just in the public spaces of chapter 2, but now here in the private spaces of chapter 3. He sends her away with instructions about when and how to leave discreetly. He cares about her safety. He cares about her reputation. He continues to be a person who is passionate about what God is passionate about. He considers the joy, the privilege of being able to be a part of God's greater purposes, far exceeding any burden of redemption. And in verses 14 and 15, he sends her away with 6 measures of grain, and he puts this on her. And I think it's about 80 pounds or so, but the precise amount kind of misses the point. The point is, this is a massive load. He is trying to signal to Ruth, and as we heard at the end of chapter 3, to Naomi, that as long as this other guy doesn't do it, he is serious. He means it. That they are in fact engaged, that their rest has been secured. And you might be tempted to ask, well, Boaz, okay, I know you didn't have engagement rings back then, but how about something a little less unwieldy, right? Like how about an anklet? But if you look at the grain seed and then the amount of it, in biblical symbolism, the number 6 often means incomplete, whereas the number 7 means complete. So when we're looking at grain seed to the 6th measure, we're talking about this symbolic expression of Ruth's greater need for a seed. Because we remember, it's not enough for Ruth and Boaz to marry. They have to have a child. And he is going to be the vehicle for much of this restoration that's going to happen. And chapter 3 ends much the same way that chapter 2 does. Ruth returns to Naomi to tell of her adventures. And she asks her a question when she comes into the city. And it's this: who are you? And we think, who are you? Why is she asking, who are you? Naomi knows exactly who Ruth is. In fact, she's probably been waiting with bated breath the entire night, trying to find out what happened on the threshing floor. But this is the exact same question that Boaz asked of Ruth on the threshing floor. And it's puzzling, and so a lot of translators have translated it into things like, how did you fare, my daughter? Or how did it go? Because what else makes sense? But the original is, who are you? And so to understand what she means by this question, we kind of have to go back and look at the character of Ruth for a second. And there's a lot of things we could talk about with her, but what are some highlights? We know she's a pretty humble woman. We know that she repeatedly steps out in faith, not just in bold ways, like this proposal or giving her whole life to the care of Naomi, but she also steps out in really ordinary ways too, like working long, hard days in the heat of the harvest, chapter 2, with only a few short breaks. We know that she's a character contrast to a lot of the characters in this story. Like, look at Orpah, her sister-in-law. In the exact same circumstances, she hightails it back to Moab to pursue the Moabite dream, pursue 2.5 healthy kids and a white picket fence and a loyal, non-shedding dog. And what does Ruth do? Ruth, on the other hand, she doesn't become more defeated. She becomes more devoted. Naomi becomes more embittered, and yet Ruth becomes more empowered. She is this Proverbs 31 woman of worth in the public spaces of chapter 2 and the private spaces of chapter 3. And what does Naomi know personally about Ruth? She knows that in chapter 1, she felt totally empty, her words. And who fills her up with the fullness of companionship of her life, herself. In chapter 2, they have nothing. Ruth is literally going out to beg. And who comes in the door at the end of chapter 2 with the fullness, just oodles of grain, way more than a beggar would ever come home with? And here we are at the end of chapter 3. And who comes walking into town with a garment full of grain seeds spilling out all over the place, that Naomi knows her rest has been secured. And it's kind of like Naomi steps back and she looks at Ruth and she says, "Who are you?" It's a question that Naomi struggles with throughout this story. She's having chapter by chapter this increasing understanding of Ruth's value to her. And it's a tricky thing for Naomi to get her mind around because she knows who Ruth is. Ruth is a Moabite. She's an outsider. She is in vulnerable circumstances too. She is grief-stricken too. She is unlikely and social heritagely unpopular. She has little to offer and nothing to qualify her. And yet it is through you, her, that the character of God keeps pouring out of her in a way that authenticates the genuineness of the rest that it is that she's found. That testifies to someone greater who has no lines in this story, and yet Ruth has full confidence, is in total control of her personal storyline and the greater storyline within which she is a part. You see, the real love story here between Boaz and Ruth, it's not what you might automatically have in your mind that it could be. We might unconsciously think of, your classic Hollywood couple. Ladies, Boaz could have been tall, dark, and handsome, but the text doesn't say. He could have been homely and pasty. And Ruth, she could have been a tiny little waif of a Hollywood thing, but I am looking at Boaz putting on 80 pounds of grain onto this woman that she's lugging back into the city. I'm just saying, maybe not. You see, I kind of hope that God gave them a bit of a romantic ooh la la, because I'm a sucker for that kind of stuff. But that's not where we're supposed to focus. This is not a lust match. This is not an infatuation match. This is a character match. What they loved in one another was their godliness. My son, several years ago now, when he was really little, he had displayed some exceptionally defiant behavior and had earned a number of consequences because of that. And so I was debriefing with him in his bedroom that night about this. And there was a lot of tears. I think some of the tears were of remorse. Some of the tears were that he knew that he had consequences to pay. He had to make things right. But into the tearful drama of this steps my husband, and he says, Andrea, I'm going to take the consequences for him. And my son, you should have seen his little face. He was stupefied. He kind of launched his body across the room, landed on his knees, and wrapped his arm around his dad that he would do this peculiar thing. Now the tears were of gratitude. And the best part about the story is that 2 weeks later, my daughter was experiencing some tearful drama of her own and looking down consequences in her life. And into the tearful drama of that, unprompted, steps my son. And he says, I'm going to take the consequences for her, Mommy. And incidentally, he did. And my eyes, they just started to like well up, and I spun around, and this is what he did. Mom, what's with all the... Why wouldn't I do this for her? Daddy did this for me 2 weeks ago. So why would this not happen? When God arrests a human heart, it can't help but be paid forward to someone else, not just as possible, but as logical, as natural. And what we see here in Boaz and Ruth are two God-saturated characters set down in a fallen world, making concrete in real life how the rest of God compels action out for the good of others and for the glory of God. And I wonder if in trials sometimes we need to ask less, what do I do now? And maybe in this, even this, how do I glorify God? What am I willing to risk? What am I willing to give up now for purposes beyond what I can currently see and feel and grasp and even prefer right now? And when we zoom out and we look at the bigger picture of which we are a part, Boaz and Ruth's story points us to God's love for his people and his invitation for us to enter into his rest. You know, back when Adam and Eve sinned, he didn't give up on us. He didn't close the book and say, that's it, I'm out of here. He chose to keep going, to persist with us in his goodness and his kindness and his covenant faithfulness to us, even when in 2019, just like the days of the judges, we cycle in our rebellion. We do what is right in our own eyes instead of what is right in God's eyes. We turn and pursue idols that will just make us more restless instead of turning our hearts towards him and enjoying and focusing on the rest that he has already secured for us. You know, you look at the Israelites, they kind of went through the Red Sea, and then they kind of came out to a type of rest on the other side. They came out of the wilderness and into this rest of Canaan, kind of under Joshua. And then there was the whole construction of the temple with its subsequent rest. God kind of dwelled there in a more intensive kind of sense. Why? All the way back in Genesis 3, God had a plan to restore fellowship, to restore rest for us. And that culminates in the coming of his son, Jesus. And Jesus, for us, is the fullness of that seventh seed that we've been waiting for. He's the ultimate culmination of the Levirate law that we just heard about. He brings in this new exodus that ushers us and leads us into a new rest that is found in him. And he came to us because he saw us wallowing there. enslaved in our circumstances, and unable to help ourselves. And he comes to us and he covers us with his wing, and he wants to wash us, and he wants to make a vow to us to have and to hold in sickness and in health, to nurture us to flourishing and advance us to royal splendor, to be co-heirs with him one day. You know, way back in creation, all 6 days, they have a beginning and an end, a morning and an evening. But the 7th day of rest doesn't. No morning, no evening. Meaning that God's rest has always been open for us to enter. Matthew 11, "Oh, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And so the question here is, have we come? Will we come? Do we need to come back again? And you know, I think it's entirely possible that we may have sat in church for 30 years and searched the scriptures, and yet we can honestly say in the privacy of our hearts that maybe we haven't had an intimate threshing floor moment with our Redeemer, where we have asked him to redeem us and come under his wing. And no matter who we are and no matter how we come, his answer is the same to us as Boaz's was to Ruth, that he would love to, because it is not his duty to do this for us. It is his delight to do this for us. His desire is not to shame us, but to accept us in spite of our shame, to reposition us in him and repurpose us for him. And for those of us who have already entered his rest by faith, this is a bit of a tricky business, isn't it? Because you see here in chapter 3, Naomi's rest has been secured, and yet, you know, her husband is still dead. Her boys are still dead. Do you think the pain of that left once their rest was secured? And so you see this example of rest running alongside pain. It's kind of like our initial confession of faith secures, settles the matter of our rest. It's like the first fruits of our rest. And then we're sent on our way into all kinds of trials. And I know some of you, and I know that the trials are heavy and they're confusing, and they bring up more questions than they do answers. They don't have closure, and that's annoying. Trials hurt. And it's kind of like we're still in a bit of a wilderness. We're still outsiders. We're still sojourners here. We know our rest has been secured, and yet we're still laboring towards this rest, this promised land for us that is to come. And I think it really helps us in these times to remember that we're not alone. In John 5, it tells us that the Father is always working. You know, when God rested back on the 7th day, it's not because he was tired. It's because he was finished. And so there's this rhythm of labor and rest. And this is God's divine design. And it's a good design because it reminds us that where we labor now, where things are incomplete for us now, where we have unrest now, that they will reach their full and final completion one day. And Jesus, our Redeemer, gets it. He knows what it's like to live a life of unrest. Think about it. He abandons his heavenly home and he comes down to earth. He can't stay in his birthplace. That's just kind of makeshift. He has to flee Bethlehem as an infant because people are trying to murder him. As an adult, people are trying to murder him. He can't place any restful confidence in his parents, his family, his disciples. And at the time of his choosing, he chose to enter the greatest unrest of all, the unrest of the cross. And in John 17, we have a picture of this. You see Jesus, and the cross is right there, and he knows it. It is looming. And he prays for the good of others and for the glory of God. In the shadow of the actual cross, he is looking beyond the personal human preference to not have to endure the agony to the godly freedom, to the godly obedience that's going to secure the freedom. He's looking beyond the immediate humiliation to the forever reconciliation, beyond the immediate death of it to the ultimate victory of it. He is the ultimate example to us of what it looks like to look beyond our temporal, unrestful circumstances and on to what is glorious. And ladies, tonight, as we do that, as we consider the rest that has been secured for us and look forward to the rest that is coming, we will be changed. It will change us into women who can step out in faith in ordinary ways and in bold ways, in ways that totally seem backwards and odd because we're looking past our human preference and onto his purposes that lie beyond what we can see. We'll be able to come humbly and yet boldly to our Redeemer, who is always so kind to receive us when we come and who loves, delights to restore what is broken. We can feel total relief that his plan does not depend on my perfection. How attractive I make myself or how eloquent I am during those critical threshing floor moments of life where there's so much hinging on it. It's a perspective that will shape us into women of worth, whose lives publicly, privately, in our inward character and our outward behavior demonstrate his value to others who are struggling, because our lives undeniably testify to the rest that it is that we've found, so that people, when they step back and they look at us individually, collectively, and ask us, who are we? We can introduce them to who he is, because they need the rest of a secure and security of a Redeemer too. And we'll be shaped into women who, not in the absence of hardship, but right in the middle of it, can be fearing the Lord and be full of hope and can laugh at the future, because we're resting safe and secure, not in our ability to hang on to him, but our confidence in the vow that he made for us, that he has secured a place for us no matter what, and is hanging on to us until we get there. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank you for the rest that it is that you have secured for us and the rest that you have promised us forever. I thank you that you are a kind Redeemer every time we come. Would you help compel our action out for others so that people will see your value and they will be able themselves to find rest in their Redeemer too. In Jesus' name I pray it. Amen.